All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone to a virtual presentation at Spokane Community College. This is made available to us by the Hagen Foundation Center for the Humanities in connection with Humanities Washington. We have the pleasure of having Clyde Ford with us today, who will be taking us on a conversation titled Talking About Race in Turbulent Times. Before I introduce him, there are a few housekeeping things I want to go over. This is an interactive conversation where Clyde may ask for audience participation. So if you're on Zoom, you can raise your hand during the participant view, or you can also make comments in the chat, which I can read out loud. If you're watching over live stream, you can make comments on the live stream, and then that information will get over to me, and I can make those comments made known to Clyde as well. Now for our introduction. Oh, sorry. At the end of the presentation, we have also set aside some time for questions. If you're watching live, you can post a question again in the comments. If you're on Zoom, you can also post your question in the chats, and I'll be reading out questions submitted in those two formats to Clyde. Now for our introduction. Clyde W. Ford is a software engineer, a chiropractor, and a psychotherapist. He's also the award-winning author of 12 works of fiction and nonfiction, whose most recent book, Think Black, a memoir about his father, the first Black software engineer in America, was published in September of 2019. Clyde earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in History and Mathematics from Wesleyan University in 1971, then worked as a systems engineer for IBM. In 1977, he returned to school, enrolling at Western States University in Portland, Oregon, where he completed his doctorate in chiropractic. Later, he undertook postdoctoral training in psychotherapy at the Synthesis Education Foundation of Massachusetts under the direction of Stephen Schatz and the Psychosynthesis Institute of New York. Ford was in private practice for 18 years as a chiropractor and psychotherapist, first in Richmond, Virginia, and later in Bellingham, Washington, where he currently resides. Please welcome Mr. Clyde Ford.
Guillermo, thank you very much for that introduction. And I also want to thank Gwen and Jillian and Jonathan and all the other people who have made this presentation possible. I think one of the things I also want to add just a little bit to that presentation, that lovely introduction that Guillermo gave me, is to say that not only have I been a chiropractor and psychotherapist in private practice, but my work in social justice, particularly my writings on race and racism, have given me the opportunity to be in some very special places. I took one of my books, We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism, on the Oprah Winfrey Show many years ago, but it was an opportunity to have a nationwide conversation on television about the issues that we'll also be talking about today. And in 2006, I was really pleased to be both nominated and receive the Zora Neale Hurst and Richard Wright Award in Nonfiction, which is really the highest honor given to an African-American author. And this year I was both surprised and pleased to have received, to be a finalist for the Zora Neale Hurst and Richard Wright Foundation. So I just want to say that I think in part because it's so much a part of why I'm doing what I'm doing. I certainly have a very deep belief in the capacity of all human beings for personal healing, both physically and psychologically. And I also believe that that same capacity for healing extends beyond the personal to communities, to families, to nations, and to the world as well too. I'm just going to take a minute to bring up the presentation that I would like to share with you tonight. And I hope that in a minute, you all can see in front of you my first screen, which says Talking About Race in Turbulent Times. So Guillermo, just maybe just say yes, you can see it, and that'll make me feel a lot more confident.
Yes, I can see it.
Great, thanks, man, I appreciate that. So, here's what I'd like to do in the hour or so that we have available to us together. We've already given just a little bit of an introduction to who I am, and you heard that really lovely introduction by Guillermo. What I would like to do is first just to share with you some thoughts and ideas from having delivered a presentation like this so many times around Washington State, across the nation, about why have or even why avoid and why people have or avoid conversations about race. I also want to just share with you a little bit of a sense of why there might be some special challenges of having a conversation about race within an academic setting like Spokane community colleges. And then I want to most importantly share with you from some tools that I know work for having difficult conversations, like a conversation about race. Now, normally when I have an hour and a half to do this presentation, we spend the last 20 minutes of the last half hour, or the first 20 minutes, I should say, of the last half hour in one-on-one breakout sessions, actually having a conversation about race. Well, that's not going to be possible this evening. So in the manner of a typical, let's say, professor at an academic institution, I'm going to give you a take-home exam, and I'm not going to grade you for it. And you'll see what I mean when we get to the end of this presentation. And finally, after that, I hope we have some time left for a question and answer period. Several things I'd like to say before we get going. And the first is that, this is an educational presentation, and the views expressed here are mine. They are not necessarily the beliefs, views, or policies of the community colleges of Spokane. And secondly, I'm assuming that you're here understanding that this is a voluntary session, and I'm hoping that you'll stay with us only because you feel the presentation offers you something of value. Look, at any point you're feeling that this presentation is not offering you something of value, or perhaps is even upsetting you in any way, please take the time to take care of yourself in whatever way is necessary. Whether that means standing up and walking away from your screen for a while and maybe coming back or maybe not, whatever it is, talking to somebody after this presentation, I'm just going to assume and I'm going to hope that you will take care of yourself in whatever way you feel necessary if that arises. Having said that, we have, as Guillermo said, an opportunity for questions. I may ask you for responses or questions during this presentation. Look, if you want to respond and you're on the Zoom call, one of the things that you can do is bring your mouse down to the bottom of your screen where you'll see the participants menu item. Click on that, a window will pop up. Usually at the bottom right of that window is a button that says raise hand. You can click that button and that will alert Guillermo to you being someone who has something to say. He'll go ahead and unmute you, and then you'll have the opportunity to speak with us. If you're joining us from a live stream outside of the Zoom call, then I think you will be able to simply use the chat function and connect directly with Guillermo, who will then read whatever responses you have to me. I think that's probably the easiest way that we can handle questions this evening. So let's get started. And I can see that as I'm trying to get started, my screen is not moving forward. Let's try it again. Wow. Okay. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. I think it's on my side, so I'm going to just take a minute and see if I can't. Oh, I apologize for this. Let me see if I can get this going in another way. Excuse me for 1 minute. Okay, let's see if this works. I'm doing this, and for whatever reason, I'm not advancing my slides. I'm really sorry, but let's try this again. What I'm going to do is to stop sharing and then start sharing again. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but this is one of the joys of doing an online presentation, right? You don't always get it to go the way you would like. So let's see if this works. Wow, this is not going so well. Remember, I'm going to keep trying this and just see if there's something that I can do that I'm not doing here. I don't see anything, but let me just keep trying going back into sharing and not sharing, and perhaps that will work at some point. Okay, well, I've gotten rid of the presentation, so let's see if now I can show it again. Again, I do apologize for this. This is really the first time it's happened this way.
Clyde, could you email it to me and then maybe I could share my screen?
I will if this doesn't work. I'm trying to bring it up one more time. And if this doesn't work, that's what we will do. So let's just see if it'll come up. And let's go back here. Share the screen. Okay, I have a feeling this just might work. I'm going through some of the screens I went through before, and again, I apologize for that. Now, let's start with a question, really, and the question is, why have a conversation about race? And these are some of the answers that I've heard as I've delivered this presentation around the state and around the country. And the first is that, you know, this is an unresolved issue that won't disappear by itself. And another response that I've heard is, if we don't talk about it, we'll only fight about it. And I think we only need to look at what some of the things that have happened in the streets this summer, what happened in Charlottesville several years ago, to recognize that this is an important conversation to have, because if we don't talk, the chances are we'll end up fighting. Why have a conversation about race? Well, as far as I know, I don't know any other way to bridge differences between people or groups or communities than to have a discussion about those differences. Why have a conversation about race? Well, it's part of the world we live in, certainly in this country. Why have a conversation about race? You know, when I asked this question this morning to the group that I spoke with here at Spokane Community Colleges, we had a number of interesting responses. And I want to do the same thing again, and that is give any of you who are participating in this presentation, either via live stream or Zoom, an opportunity to share your thoughts about why should we have a conversation about race. And again, I'll remind you, you can do that by clicking the participants menu item and then clicking the raise hand button, or by using the chat function to communicate directly with Guillermo. And I'll just ask you, Guillermo, do we have anybody coming through on either the chat or raising their hand?
Yes, we have someone who mentioned it, if we don't talk about it, then it gets forgotten and stays unresolved. Life goes on as usual for those of us it doesn't affect.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
We do have someone also mentioned, how can I understand what people of color are going through if I don't listen to them directly?
So in that, I heard an importance to be able to listen to someone else about the situations that they might be faced with. We'll take one more if there is. If not, we'll move on. Guillermo, do we have any other comments?
Not as of right now.
Great. So then let's take the opposite and say, why is it that some people would rather avoid a conversation about race? You know, these are some of the comments that I've heard. I'm afraid of revealing my true feelings. Easier not to have a conversation, because if I do, I might reveal what I truly feel. if I do reveal what I truly feel, people won't understand me. I'd rather avoid a conversation about race, because if I have that conversation, people who don't understand me might call me a blank. You fill in the blank with whatever labels a person might be called. Another reason to avoid a conversation about race, it's too divisive, and we live in such a divisive society. Why add fuel to the fire that's already there? I don't feel safe having a conversation about a difficult subject like race. And again, I'll ask if there's anyone joining us via live stream or Zoom who'd like to say or share their thoughts about why avoid a conversation about race. And I'll take a moment and let Guillermo scan whatever person is raising their hand or whatever the chat is. And I'll ask you, Guillermo, do we have anyone coming through on chat who wants to share their thoughts or ideas?
Not for this one particularly, but Renee did want to mention for the last question why we need to talk about race is we need to permanently embrace the act of challenging ourselves and our personal attitudes as a reason to talk about it.
Thank you. Let's then keep moving on. And before I get to this one, let me just tell you a personal story about why I think it's important to have a conversation about race. It must have been about 25 years ago that I was in Germany. And I used to go there every summer. I was invited by an institute outside of Freiburg, which is near the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, to teach a class on somatic psychology. I taught this class many times in the United States and a number of times in Europe. And I had a pretty good feeling for how long it took for each segment, each module of the class to proceed, particularly the exercises that I gave participants in order to go through and then talk to each other about this. But when I did the exercise in Germany, what I found invariably is that if I did an exercise that then required a discussion between two people that would normally take, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes, time after time again, that exercise, that discussion took 20, 25, 30 minutes or even longer. It really kind of threw off my schedule. And it got to the point that I was wondering, why is it that it's just happening here? Is it something to do with the German language? And those of you that speak German know that a lot of the German words are longer, and so it takes a longer time to say something than you might in another language. I just wasn't sure. And so I asked the class, why is it that when we do an exercise, it takes this long for us to have the conversations that normally happen in a lot shorter time? And this is what I heard. We have these kind of conversations and we make sure we really get out everything we're feeling, and we have the opportunity to listen to whatever that person is saying. We do that now because a generation ago, our parents and our grandparents didn't have those conversations about what was taking place in the Third Reich all around them. Wow. When I heard that, I really had a great deal of respect for the participants in that workshop. And from then on, I wasn't sure that it mattered whether my schedule was kept. What was much more important was the fact that these people understood the value of talking about an issue and understanding another person's point of view in order not to repeat the errors of a past generation. And then about 10 years after my last trip to Germany, I was in South Africa, where my sister taught at the University of Witwatersrand. And I remember being there. One of the things that was going on at that time was the empanelment and the actual implementation of a number of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And basically what the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa said is, look, if you participated actively in apartheid, in the oppression and subjugation of Black South Africans, and you are willing to come forward and speak truthfully and honestly about your role in apartheid, and also to listen to how your role impacted the lives of individuals, if you're willing to do that, then we as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are willing to consider amnesty for whatever acts of violence or whatever other criminal acts you may have committed during the apartheid era. Now, certainly South Africa is not a perfect society, and there are many, many issues in South Africa that still need resolution. But the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people spoke and people listened, that seemed to me to be a really good model for how we here in this country ought to have difficult conversations like this conversation about race. Now, in an academic setting, what are some of the challenges of having a conversation about race? Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, not the only challenges, but one challenge is something that we see now that really wasn't part of my experience in academia, but this whole notion of safe spaces. And I think we need to seriously consider what that means to have safe spaces within the context of having challenging conversations in an academic setting. Is a safe space a place to coddle students, or a space where we create a place of non-intimidation and non-harassment? Is a safe space a place where we protect students or prepare them for encounters with others who don't think like them? Is a safe space a place where we isolate ourselves, or a place of intellectual confrontation, where we have the opportunity to engage, even in challenging discussions, with someone who doesn't agree with us? Are we talking about spaces which are 100% safe, or are we talking about a space which is safe enough because students are not intimidated, they're not harassed, and they are prepared intellectually and academically to have encounters and discussions and to intellectually confront those who may think different from them? I think it's important in an academic environment to consider what we mean about safe spaces and how we as teachers, administrators, and also students seek out and create those safe spaces. I'm not going to answer that for you at Spokane Community Colleges, but I do think the questions around safe space have a lot to do with how we have challenging conversations about race and other potentially divisive issues within an academic setting. So, what goes into a conversation about race? 3 things. Very easily said, a little more difficult to implement or actually bring forward in our lives. The first thing that goes into a conversation about race is basic definitions. Second thing that goes into a conversation about race is active listening. And I'll go on to describe each of these more fully. And the third thing that goes into a conversation about race, or really any other difficult conversation, is how do you engage in that conversation, not just from your head, but from your heart, not just from what you're thinking, but really what you're feeling. Look, in academic settings, in education, right from the beginning of our first, grade school or pre-kindergarten class, we don't teach the skills of good conversation, particularly around difficult issues. What we do teach is how to debate each other, how to have a conversation which often talks over another person or tries to find the points that score in terms of having a discussion that's more of a one-sided, this is what I think, that it is really an active listening session. I know as a psychotherapist, because I've sat across from couples and from families and in groups where people are having difficult conversations, that the only way to have those conversations is by understanding what it means to have some basic definitions, to actively listen, and to be able to speak and engage from your feelings, not just from your thoughts. So let's go a little bit further into each of these areas. First of all, basic definitions. I think this is really important for us to understand that there is no scientific basis for race, that race is a social construct. And by what I mean by a social construct is that race is a constructed entity that we use for various purposes socially but there is no underlying scientific basis for the idea of race. For example, at one point, Africans were considered the darkest skinned people in the world until native Pacific Islanders were found to have skin as dark as many Africans. And at one point, Europeans were considered to have the straightest hair and thinnest noses until those same native Pacific Islanders were found to have just as straight hair and just as thin noses. Oops, all of a sudden race is non-existent in terms of our normal social constructs. Blood protein matching shows Northern Europeans are physiologically closer to Africans than to Asians or Pacific Islanders. Wow. But DNA matching shows those same Northern Europeans evolutionarily closer to Australian Aborigines than to Africans. Wow, again. Again, here, the idea of race really is exploded in terms of a scientific basis. And we can see, again, it is a social construct. DNA fingerprinting shows, really, and many of us know this by now, that all humans emerged from a common African ancestor some 150 to 200,000 years ago. The fact is that groups of humans categorized by similar skin color, hair texture, or other body characteristics that we ordinarily think of as describing a race, that only developed within our human family about 90,000 years ago. What have scientists said? As early as 1930s, scientists were talking about how impossible it was to scientifically define a basis for race, like Franz Boas in 1936, or like Julian Huxley and A.C. Haddon, also in 1936, saying that race in terms of a subspecies of human is purely hypothetical. It just doesn't correspond to anything that's found, and certainly doesn't add up to the kinds of subspecies we might find in animal populations. Hans Kamlitz said in 1958, hey, we talk about race, but really that's such a debased word. It's not very helpful. Again, because there is no scientific basis for it. I think my favorite quote here is from Ashley Montagu, who said also in 1958 that terms like race should be designed to fit the facts instead of the facts being forced into what he called the Procrustean rack. And I love that phrase. Procrustean really is just another word for saying predetermined, and we predetermine categories of people who then we fit into as though there were really existing races. And Montagu was to say that the term race goes far beyond any of the facts and only serves to obscure them. I think that's some important understanding to have in terms of a discussion or a conversation about race. And another basic definition, and I have to say, if those of you watching this presentation take nothing away than the following slide, I will feel as though I have perhaps done something valuable tonight. The slide I'm about to show you comes from the 1970 Kerner Commission, impaneled by Lyndon Baines Johnson, then the President of the United States, to investigate why it was that in 1968 and 1969, those summers were particularly violent summers where cities like New York and Detroit and Los Angeles and Chicago were up in flames because of issues surrounding race. I was really surprised at the Kerner Commission's report because most of the people on that commission were white Southerners and most were men. And I wasn't really sure at first that those were a group of people who would really penetrate some of these issues to come up with the important ideas that were underlying this unrest in cities. So I was really surprised when the Kerner Commission came up with what I think is one of the best definitions about race and racism that I can come up with, and certainly one that I've used in the last 25 years of doing presentations like this. And here's what the Kerner Commission said. Anybody can be prejudiced. Prejudice is just forming an opinion in the absence of all relevant information. And sometimes even when you get that relevant information, you still maintain your original belief, which is prejudice. I might not like you because you're too short or too tall, or because you have blonde hair or blue hair, or because you're too thin, or you're, as far as I'm concerned, you're too heavy. I can have any number of prejudicial ideas about you that may form my opinion in the absence of all the relevant information, which might cause me to revise that prejudice. And as I said, I even still might not revise that prejudice, but prejudice alone does not rise to being racist. The Kerner Commission in 1970 said, it's when you add power to prejudice that you come up with racism. Racism, they said, is when prejudice combines with the power to affect someone's life physically, emotionally, economically, politically, educationally, and in other ways. Wow, again, that's been a really important definition for me. You know, if you were riding in a car with me, a lot of times if we were listening to radio, the news, it could even be NPR, you'd find me screaming at the radio saying, my God, they're using a definition like racism without defining it, and it doesn't fit what's really being discussed, because what's really being discussed is prejudice as opposed to racism. And I think that splitting up of that term into prejudice plus power really gives us the opportunity to talk about what's prejudice and how do we combat that, what's power, and all the different levels of power, whether it's institutional power, whether it's political power, whether it's personal power, whether it's the power of privilege, all of the different varying gradations of that, to have a more nuanced discussion about race and racism. It also gives us the opportunity to have a little bit better conversation about terms we throw around, like racist, anti-racist, reverse racist. Using the Kerner Commission's definition, for example, where would we find a situation of reverse racism? Very, very rarely. Might we find a situation of reverse prejudice? Sure. But again, when you think about racism or racist being prejudice plus power, very rarely are the communities that are subject to racism also the communities which have the power to do anything about that. And therefore, the whole idea, or the whole notion of reverse racism really is one that I think falls by the wayside based on this definition, whereas again, reverse prejudice is something that I think does exist. It's been pointed out on any number of occasions that this isn't a bad definition, not just for racism, but for sexism, for ageism, and for any of the other contentious issues where prejudice combines with power in order to impact somebody's life. Now, a lot of times when I'm doing this presentation and I give this definition of racism, I'm able to see, as I'm not right now because I can't see any of you, I'm able to see in the faces of a lot of people in front of me a kind of sense of relief, almost hearing a collective sigh where people say, oh my God, maybe I'm prejudiced, but maybe I'm not racist. And I think that's a really great place to start to have a discussion about race, because it tells us, again, how we can combat prejudice, which may be very different from how we might want to combat power. So I am going to take another opportunity here, and having presented this basic definition about race being prejudice, or racism being prejudice plus power, to implement that prejudice, I'm going to ask, what's it like for those of you listening, watching this presentation, to hear this definition? And I'll pause for a moment to see if you want to either raise your hand by clicking the button, or if you are typing something in to a chat that Guillermo can then share with me. What's it like to hear this definition of racism equated to prejudice plus power? And Guillermo, I'll ask once again if you see anyone who's typing in anything or raising their hand.
Pretty quiet.
Great. Well, I don't mind that. So it's good either way. So let's just keep going on.
We did have someone comment right now, prejudice doesn't seem powerful enough a word for some of the terrible ways people treat each other.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think it is when prejudice is added to the power that people have, whether that's personal power, political power, or whether it's the power of privilege. And again, for me at least, I think it's the Kerner Commission that allows this definition, this separation, which gives us the opportunity to talk about how is it and why is it that people feel they can treat each other in these often terrible ways. And I think it is treatment is what the Kerner Commission would say, that's the power. Prejudice is the belief, treatment, how we engage with each other, that's the power to affect somebody physically, emotionally, educationally, or otherwise, as the definition suggests. Anyone else, Guillermo?
Yeah, we have a couple more. We have someone else who mentioned, I think it helps to break barriers to begin a conversation.
Thank you.
And then one other one, it helps this particular person, June, understand my siblings' behavior a little better. She has prejudice, but doesn't consider herself racist.
Thank you.
And then one last one is, I think it's important for people to know that racism can be expressed as an individual act, and it can be expressed when people do nothing about systems which protects whiteness.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And once again, power goes both ways in the sense that power can be the act of doing something, and those in positions of power who don't do something, that's also a way of talking about how power is not used when it could be used. So again, I find that this discussion really is opened up by this definition and gives us an opportunity to have a much more nuanced conversation about these very issues. So thank you everyone who added your thoughts and ideas to this discussion. So basic definitions. You know, in an academic environment, I also want to mention that one of the other things that sometimes happens is what we call pedagogical bypass. And by pedagogical bypass, what I mean is using pedagogical ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved instructional precepts, emotional issues, psychological wounds, or social injustices, both within teachers and students. That's a definition. Let me give you some real practical examples of what I mean by that. So an institution, a teacher, or even a student might say, you know, I or we were really filled at this institution with some universal humanistic pedagogical principles that honor and respect all students. I or we could never be considered, this institution could never be considered prejudiced or racist based on the founding principles that we have. That's an example which perhaps bypasses the real lived experiences of the students and the teachers and maybe even the staff who are part of that educational institution's family. Another really good example of that concerns academic freedom. One hears academic freedom demands that any ideas can be discussed on campus without concern for how they might affect a particular person or group. Only intellectual rigor is important. Again, that may bypass how some ideas do affect a particular person or group. And if that is not addressed, perhaps is another example of pedagogical bypass. So, some basic definitions. Let's talk about active listening as an important component of having a conversation about race. The first element of active listening is being able to listen without talking. Now, again, we didn't have the opportunity to actually hear anybody live over Zoom, so I didn't have the opportunity to engage with anyone around whatever their comments, thoughts, or ideas were. We learn, however, not how to listen. We learn how to have a conversation in our mind as somebody else is talking. And that's the great thing in debates, right? one person is talking and the other person who's supposed to be listening is really having a conversation in their mind which says, well, that person said this, which means I can say that. They didn't say that, that means I can say it. Well, they didn't quite say it the right way, so I can take it and turn it around and that'll score points for me. And the best example, I think, of this is to just look at cable news, something like CNN, where they bring together a group of people, supposed experts in a field, to have a discussion. When have you ever really seen a discussion? It's not a conversation, it's a talk fest. It's a talk fest of talking heads where one person talks on top of each other, and it's really a question of who can jump in. We saw this in the first debate where it wasn't a question of actually having a reasoned conversation. It was a question where one of the people in the debate was simply jumping in, talking over, and essentially bullying the other person. And that is not how you have a conversation about important topics. That's how you debate. So listening without talking, simply listening to what the person is saying, and then be able to say to that person, did I hear you say this? And give the person an opportunity to correct themselves. You don't have to repeat exactly what it is you heard because you're going to hear it in your own words. And it's fine to then repeat back to a person in the words that you would have what you feel you heard, by also asking them, hey, did I get it right? And if you didn't hear it right, then asking the person to help you correct your understanding of what you heard. Now, these are some of the basic tools that, we spend a lot of time in psychotherapy school learning about, because these are the skills which really help us as psychotherapists be able to help other individuals have challenging conversations, mostly in relationships. And anybody who's been in a relationship knows exactly what I'm talking about. The ability to listen without talking is a challenging skill in a relationship. And the ability to feel heard or to hear somebody can be equally challenging. I want to add one more thing to this business of active listening, and that's simply respect for another person. I'm amazed at how many times I will hear people say, if I listen to what a person is saying, it means that I agree with them. And I don't think there could be anything more inaccurate than that. I think it's possible, I know it certainly is with me and many others, to listen to what somebody says and completely disagree with what they say, but still to respect them with the act of allowing yourself to listen to what they're saying. Listening, repeating, respecting, those are the three basic tools of active listening. A lot easier said than done, but I think still important skills for us to develop, potentially to teach as well too. Now, there are some nonverbal skills, non-auditory skills, some body awareness skills that also go into the practice of active listening. And we have an acronym for them. We call them SOLAR. Instead of an A, it's an E. And the S stands for sitting or facing another person squarely. Now, in my presentations that we have groups for longer periods of time, often we'll have people, and this is in pre-COVID days, sometimes we'll do it in breakout rooms during this time, where one or two people, one and one, they're facing each other, even potentially on screen. And the idea is you don't want to be, kind of looking off to the side, because that suggests you're not really involved. The O is to keep an open posture. That means you're not talking to somebody like this, or your legs are crossed. I can't do that, or I'll fall down because I'm standing right now. But an open posture says that you're making another person feel welcome and engaged. Lean. This is something, again, maybe a little bit more difficult to do online than it is in person. But when you're leaning forward, it says you're engaged in that conversation. When you're leaning backwards, it's almost as though whatever that person's saying is repulsing you, or you don't want to be there. In a similar way, making good eye contact really shows that you're involved. You're not looking off at your watch or looking off at your cell phone, that you're looking at the person. And that's something you actually can do, even if it is online. And finally, the R is that it's relaxed. that you're calm, you're not fidgeting. For example, you're not tapping your fingers on your knees or tapping your toe on the floor. Both activities communicate a sense of not fully being present. And the whole piece about active listening is that you want to, you should be, you could be fully present. So I think the two following quotes are two wonderful quotes that I always remember. One is by Andrew Bennett, who reminds us that one of the longest journeys we will ever take is the 18 inches from our head to our heart. And also a quote from Lao Tzu, who said, the first step on the path to wisdom is the ability to say, I don't know. Both of those quotes reflect this idea that we can engage with someone from our heart, not from our head, from our feelings, not from our thoughts. We train people again in our classrooms, on our media. We train people how to engage each other in their heads. That's why we call them talking heads, right? I never heard the phrase talking hearts. That would be an interesting situation to actually see. Talking heads are people who generally are not talking to each other, they're talking at each other, if not talking over or under each other. And we want to try to avoid that if we're going to have a difficult conversation, particularly a conversation about race. How do you engage from your feelings as opposed to your thoughts? How do you engage from your heart as opposed to your head? One of the easiest ways to do that when you're listening is by asking yourself, how does this make me feel? How does what the other person's saying make me feel? Rather than, what does this make me think? Too often, we're simply listening for the purpose of figuring out what we can say. That means we're thinking about what that other person is saying. We're not listening to what that other person is saying. We're not letting it touch us in a way that might impact us. A lot of people, some people, I should say, do have some difficulty of, what is this whole business of feelings? I don't get that. I don't think that way, which is an interesting statement that people make. I don't engage with other people that way. And for those folks, I simply ask them to tune into the sensations that they're aware of in their body. Many people can do that. Oh, while I'm having this conversation, I'm feeling some tightness in my lower back, or I'm feeling some tension in my neck, or my shoulders feel like they're rising, or I'm sweating a little more. And there's a lot of ways to tune into what your body is doing. And your body is a great indicator of what your feelings are. Even if you can't connect with what those feelings are, 9 times out of 10 people can connect with what's going on in their body. In the same way, if you're talking, if you're speaking, you can speak by offering, this is how I feel, rather than this is what I think. Again, we're taught to share, well, this is what I think about a particular issue. And I always like to ask people to go beneath that sense of thinking to what the underlying feeling is, if you can't get there, because maybe this is not, the language you're used to communicating on about your feelings. Certainly, once again, your sensations can really be appropriate. Here, you can ask yourself or even share, as I'm trying to talk about this challenging issue, like this issue about race and my feelings about race, I'm aware of these things going on in my body. My lower back is tense, my leg is tight, my arms are twitching a little bit, I'm sweating more than usually. Those are really good clues to how you're feeling. The fact is that no one changes because you scream your thoughts in their direction. What we do know about how people change is when people recognize the commonalities that they have between them. And those commonalities often have more to do with how a person is feeling as opposed to what a person is thinking, which is why engaging from your heart as opposed to engaging from your head can really be so important in having a difficult and challenging conversation, like a conversation about race. Now, were we to have had a longer time together, I would have invited you into Zoom breakout sessions with 2 people in each session, where each person would have a chance to be a speaker and the other person a listener. And I would challenge you then to use these tools, 3 tools of really having a difficult conversation, basic definitions, active listening, and engaging from your heart, not your head, your feelings, not your thoughts. I would challenge you to use those tools in having this conversation. Obviously, one person would speak first and then the other. And what I would challenge you to have this conversation about is, as a student, a teacher, an administrator, or a staff member, what has my experience of race been like on this campus or on another campus that I've been at? Since we don't have the time to do that in this session, I am going to assign that to you as a take-home exam. I'm going to ask you in the next day or two, next week, it doesn't really matter, to find someone, maybe even someone you've never engaged with before, and to say to yourself and to that person, hey, I'd like to have a conversation that maybe stretches my limits a little bit. It's a conversation about race, and these are the ways in which I'd like to try to have that conversation. I want to make sure that I'm really listening and hearing. I want to make sure that I'm trying to talk from my heart and not my head. And I also want to make sure that we're engaged by having some basic definitions that we're talking about. Maybe even talking about that definition about racism being prejudice plus power and what that means. So again, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to assign that to you as take-home homework that I'm not going to be there to grade, but I can tell you from my past experience of having people do this during a workshop, during a session like this, it's amazing what happens when people use these tools of having a good conversation to have a conversation about a difficult topic, like a conversation on race. And Guillermo, let me ask you to give me a little bit of a time check and to see where we are right now.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left, about 6 minutes. I think this is a good time if anyone has questions.
I think this would be a great time. So let me stop sharing and ask if there's anyone who has any questions, comments, observations based on this presentation. Please get them to Guillermo or raise your hand in the Zoom environment, and we'll see what we can do to answer those questions.
And while we wait, I think I'll share a couple of comments that people have expressed in the comment section. One of the participants shared, "Power is such a sharp tool. I've spent a great deal of effort protecting my children against the power of some of the elders in our family."
Thank you.
One other comment also is, "Academic freedom does not excuse or should not allow hate."
Thank you. And that's the whole idea of pedagogical or academic bypass there. Thank you. So again, I'm just waiting, pausing to see if there is anyone else who would like to add their thoughts or has any questions that we might try to answer at this point.
So we have Renee asking, "I'd love to hear your answer to that same question about race in the academic world."
I think the question, let me repeat this and see if that's my understanding, that academic freedom should not excuse or be the basis for promoting hatred, if I remember correctly. Is that right, Guillermo?
Yes.
And so I think it's a simple response. I certainly would agree with that I think there is a way, even, however, to discuss some of the abuses that happen in an academic environment and still look at them without making people who might be discovering these abuses, I'm thinking of students, feel intimidated. I'm currently working on my next book, which is a book that has a whole chapter about some of the horrors about race and racism that came through places like Harvard University and Yale University and Columbia University, because scholars thought this was the right thing to do. So I do think it's possible to have discussions about really challenging issues and even hatred without promoting that in an academic environment. And that's part of the challenge of being a good teacher and a good instructor, is how do you do that? I don't think you do that by avoiding those issues. I do think you do that by creating a safe enough space for students in your environment to explore those issues in a non-threatening, non-intimidating way that really helps to empower them to counter the very ideas which would lead to hate.
Clyde, we have a similar question. One of our participants is asking, do you have any advice or direction for administrators at SCC on how to address structural racism at a historically white institution?
Yeah, and I think my first advice really would be try to use some of the tools that we spoke about tonight to engage in discussions about race and racism. And I think that's really important. This is an issue we just don't talk about enough. And the work that I do, particularly with high-tech firms, because of my background in technology, is to open up these firms to discussions among employees, among administrators, among people who are the decision makers, to have conversations. The one thing we don't have in this country is a good history of talking about the very issues that we need to talk about. When I referred to that situation in South Africa of truth and reconciliation, there are two elements that went into that: truth and reconciliation. You don't get to reconciliation until you have a discussion about the truths, whether those are truths about the current situation of systemic racism at an institution, about privilege and power. You've got to have those discussions, and you need to have them in a way that you're not afraid of having them, because you recognize that even if there is fear, having those discussions is a way to bring about reconciliation. So I can't think of a more important thing to do than to begin to have discussions about the issues that may be present on a campus or in an institution.
We also have another comment that says these listening skills apply to every conversation, and they're thanking you for those.
Absolutely. Again, we don't train people how to have conversations. We train people how to debate. I think that needs to be different. I think it's the job, the goal, it should be of every teacher, of every institution, to help students not just learn how to debate, not just learn how to think critically. All of those are important, but also how to have a discussion about important issues that allows them to hear other people, to listen, and then to really bring forward not just what they're thinking, but also what they're feeling. Those are really important skills. They can be learned. I know they can be learned because I learned them as a psychotherapist, and we teach psychotherapists how to do that. We can teach anybody how to do that.
All right, Clyde, I think that was perfect ending to a great conversation. And I know we appreciate the tools that you've given us and the listening skills. We just want to say thank you so much for taking today to work with our campus.
Guillermo, thank you also. And again, I apologize for whatever glitch happened technologically. I'm just glad we could get past that and actually get to the presentation. Thank you all for attending and participating, and I look forward to any future engagement with the community colleges of Spokane. Good night. Have a great evening.
Thank you.